The morning was supposed to be like any other. Crisp air, the smell of pine, and the satisfaction of knowing I had a neatly stacked pile of firewood ready for the winter season. But as I stepped outside, coffee in hand, a pit formed in my stomach. The spot where my firewood had been just yesterday was now empty, wiped completely clean as if it had never existed. At first, I thought I might have miscounted how much I had left, but the sight before me told me otherwise. Not a single log remained, not even the stray splinters that usually fell loose when stacking. Someone hadn't just taken a few pieces. They had taken everything. My pulse quickened, my fingers tightening around the handle of my mug. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was outright theft. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe some desperate neighbor had taken a few logs in a pinch and gotten carried away. Maybe some teenagers thought it'd be funny to make off with a full supply. But no, none of that made sense. My firewood had been tucked away neatly in my backyard, behind a locked gate, protected from the prying eyes of passersby. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately come onto my property, taken their time, and stolen my entire supply of winter firewood. I felt my jaw clench as I stormed back inside, marching straight to my office where my home security system was set up. If someone had the nerve to steal from me, I was going to find out exactly who they were. I clicked through the footage, skimming through the hours of stillness, until the timestamp from last night rolled in. My breath caught as the screen revealed a figure I had come to know all too well, Karen. The HOA president, the self-appointed ruler of our neighborhood, the woman who had made it her personal mission to enforce ridiculous rules while bending them to her own advantage. And there she was, standing in my backyard, wearing her usual smug expression as if she had every right to be there. My teeth ground together as I watched the scene unfold. She wasn't alone. Two men, hired movers by the looks of it, were with her, stacking my firewood into the back of a pickup truck under her supervision. She wasn't even trying to be sneaky about it. In broad daylight, she barked orders, waved her hand like some kind of royalty, and directed them as if my property was hers to redistribute. I felt a surge of white-hot anger build in my chest. The entitlement, the audacity, it was unreal. I could already predict her excuse, could hear her voice dripping with condescension as she dismissed my rightful ownership. "Oh, it was a community safety hazard," she would say, or perhaps, "We needed extra firewood for the HOA bonfire, and yours was the most accessible." I had seen her pull this routine before, justifying every overreach with some fabricated rule or concern. But this time she had gone too far. Fueled by fury, I grabbed my jacket and stormed out the door, heading straight for her house. She lived just a few blocks away, in a house that looked more like a shrine to the HOA than a home. An oversized American flag hung perfectly centered on the porch, her grass trimmed to an almost unnatural precision, and her mailbox so pristine that I swore she polished it daily. Before I could even knock, the door swung open, and there she stood, already looking mildly irritated, as if I had inconvenienced her by showing up. "Oh, Jake, good morning," she said with a saccharine smile, folding her arms. "What can I do for you?" I forced my voice to remain steady, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to unleash my frustration. "You can start by explaining why you stole my firewood," I said, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. Karen blinked, then scoffed, shaking her head as if I had just accused her of something absurd. "Stole? Oh, Jake, that's such a strong word. I simply repurposed it for the benefit of the community." My blood boiled. Repurposed it? Karen, that was my firewood. I paid for it. I stacked it. And now it's gone. She let out a dramatic sigh, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Jake, you know as well as I do that the HOA has certain standards. Your firewood pile was, well, unsightly. It didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony." I stared at her in disbelief. "Karen, it was in my backyard. No one could even see it." She waved a hand dismissively, as if my point was entirely irrelevant. "That's not the issue here. The HOA bonfire is this weekend, and we needed extra firewood. Yours was the closest and most convenient." A humorless laugh escaped me. "So you just helped yourself to it? Without asking?" She let out a huff of impatience. "Oh, Jake, it's just firewood. I don't see why you're making such a fuss. You can always get more." My fists clenched at my sides. She was doing it again, twisting the situation, making me seem like the unreasonable one. But I wasn't going to let her gaslight me into backing down. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Fine," I said, stepping back. "If you want to play it that way, Karen, go ahead. Enjoy my firewood. But just know, you've made a huge mistake." She chuckled, her expression full of condescension. "Oh, Jake, always so dramatic. It's just firewood." I turned and walked away, my mind already working. Karen had been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom for years, but this time, she had gone too far. She had taken from me not out of necessity, but out of sheer entitlement, believing there would be no consequences. But she was wrong. Very, very wrong. By the time I reached my house, an idea had already begun to form. A plan so perfect, so deviously poetic, that I nearly laughed out loud. Karen thought she could take whatever she wanted. She thought she could get away with it, but she had no idea what was coming next. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. She had taken my firewood with the same smug entitlement she used to dictate everything in this neighborhood, assuming there would be no consequences. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't the type to roll over and accept being walked on. No, I believed in consequences. And since the HOA wasn't going to hold her accountable, I would. The idea came to me in a flash. A stroke of poetic justice so perfect that I almost had to sit down and laugh. Karen wanted my firewood? Fine. I'd give her all the firewood she could ever want. But this time it would come with a little surprise. I spent the rest of the day gathering supplies, my mind racing with every detail of my plan. First, I needed new logs, ones that would blend in seamlessly with the ones she had already taken. I had some spare pieces of firewood in my garage, enough to create a new pile that looked identical to the one Karen had stolen. But these wouldn't just be ordinary logs. Oh no, these were going to be special. I took my time, carefully hollowing out the centers of each one, making sure the outer shell remained intact so that they still looked like solid firewood. By the time I was done, I had a stack of seemingly ordinary logs that were, in reality, little wooden time bombs waiting to explode into chaos. Next came the real piece de resistance, fire ants. Not just any ants, but red imported fire ants, the kind that bite like tiny demons and swarm in an aggressive frenzy at the slightest disturbance. I had seen firsthand what these creatures were capable of back when I lived in the South. One wrong step into a fire ant mound, and you'd be hopping around like your feet were on fire, trying to swat them off before they left you covered in painful welts. It was the kind of experience you never forgot. And now, those little devils were going to help me serve Karen the sweetest dish of revenge she had ever tasted. Getting the ants was easier than expected. A quick trip to an old gardening buddy of mine, who dealt with pest control, and I had exactly what I needed. An entire container of furious, writhing, stinging nightmares just waiting to be unleashed. I brought them home carefully, making sure they stayed contained until it was time. Then, with gloves on and my heart racing with anticipation, I began the process of transferring them into their new homes. I placed them inside the hollowed logs, ensuring that they had enough space to move around but not enough to escape just yet. The plan was simple. Once Karen tossed these logs into the bonfire, the heat would drive the ants out in a panicked swarm, and she would be right in the middle of it. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across my yard. I stood back, wiping the sweat from my forehead, and admired my work. The logs looked perfect, no different from any other firewood. If Karen's greed played out the way I expected, she would take them without a second thought, just like she had before. All I had to do now was set the bait. I stacked the firewood neatly by the side of my garage, deliberately making it look like I had simply replenished my supply. Karen was nothing if not predictable. She thrived on power, on proving that she could take whatever she wanted without consequence. And I knew that when she saw the fresh pile sitting there, she wouldn't be able to resist helping herself to it again. I barely had to wait. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee by the window, I spotted her. She was standing at the edge of my yard, hands on her hips, surveying my new stack of firewood like a vulture circling its next meal. I watched as her lips curled into a smirk, and she pulled out her phone, no doubt calling her movers again. Sure enough, within 20 minutes, a familiar pickup truck rolled up, the same two men from before stepping out and waiting for Karen's instructions. She waved them over, gesturing grandly toward my woodpile as if it were her own personal inventory. I leaned back in my chair, suppressing a grin as I watched them load the logs into the truck, one by one. Karen didn't lift a finger herself, of course. She never did. She simply stood there, overseeing the operation like some kind of tyrant overseeing a labor force. I could even hear her from inside my house, talking about how the community bonfire would be bigger and better than ever this year, and how she was so generous to provide extra firewood. Oh, Karen, if only you knew. Once the truck was loaded, she clapped her hands together, giving her men an approving nod before sending them off. Then, without even glancing in my direction, she strutted back down the street toward her house, undoubtedly feeling victorious. I sat back, taking a slow sip of my coffee, feeling nothing but satisfaction. The trap was set. All that was left now was to wait for the bonfire. That evening, I strolled through the neighborhood, catching snippets of conversation as people excitedly talked about the upcoming event. The annual HOA Bonfire was one of the few times the community actually gathered for something other than passive-aggressive HOA meetings. Kids looked forward to roasting marshmallows, adults brought their best homemade ciders, and people who normally ignored each other would gather around the flames, pretending for one night that the HOA wasn't a bureaucratic nightmare. Karen, of course, was the self-proclaimed star of the event. She had made it her mission to host the bonfire every year, standing front and center, soaking up the admiration like a queen presiding over her kingdom. This year would be no different except for one little detail. The firewood she had stolen was going to steal the show. As I made my way home, I could hardly contain my anticipation. I pictured it all in my head. The smug look on Karen's face as she tossed the first log into the flames. The slow build of heat waking up the thousands of fire ants inside. The moment they realized they were trapped and swarmed out in a panicked frenzy. The image of Karen shrieking, flailing, running for her life as chaos erupted around her. It was almost too good to be true. But it was true. It was happening. And it was happening tomorrow night. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood around me. In just 24 hours, Karen was going to get exactly what she deserved. For the first time since she had stolen my firewood, I felt at peace. Tomorrow, justice would be served. And it would sting. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long, golden streaks over the neighborhood as the much-anticipated HOA bonfire event approached. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning wood from early fire pits as families prepared for the gathering. People bustled along the sidewalks with folding chairs and blankets, chatting excitedly about the night ahead. But as I stepped out of my house, strolling casually toward the park where the event was set to take place, I wasn't thinking about the cider or the marshmallows or the cheerful atmosphere. No, my mind was fixated on one thing: Karen's impending downfall. She had no idea. The stage was set, the trap was in place, and all I had to do was sit back and watch the chaos unfold. As I arrived at the park, I spotted Karen immediately. She stood near the towering bonfire pit, glowing with self-importance, her hands gesturing grandly as she spoke to a group of residents. She was in full performance mode, soaking up the admiration of those around her. The firewood she had stolen, my firewood, or at least what she thought was my firewood, was neatly stacked beside her, ready to be thrown into the flames. A wide smile stretched across her face as she relished in her role as the benevolent HOA leader, taking credit for the extra supply she had so generously secured for the community. I had to suppress a grin. I found a seat near the back of the gathering, keeping my distance but ensuring I had a perfect view of the fire pit. People were settling in, sipping on spiced cider and hot cocoa, chatting about the upcoming holidays. The flames from the bonfire flickered, crackling in the center of the event space, waiting to consume the wood stacked beside it. My heart pounded with anticipation. And then the moment arrived. Karen, ever the drama queen, clapped her hands for attention. The murmur of conversation died down as she stepped forward, her face alight with self-satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Welcome to another successful HOA Bonfire event. As always, it is my pleasure to ensure that our neighborhood remains a warm, inviting, and orderly community." She paused, basking in the polite applause. "And this year, thanks to some extra generosity, we have an abundance of firewood to keep the flames burning all night long." I barely stopped myself from laughing. She turned to the pile of logs, bending down to select the first one. I recognized it instantly, one of the hollowed-out logs, filled with my little army of fire ants. With a grand gesture, she lifted the log high above her head, smiling for the crowd. "Let's get this fire roaring," she declared, and with a dramatic flourish, she tossed it into the flames. The log hit the fire with a satisfying thunk, sending a burst of sparks into the air. The flames licked hungrily at the wood, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Karen turned back to the crowd, already moving on to her next self-congratulatory speech. But then it began. At first, just a few, tiny, frantic creatures, emerging from the cracks in the log, their movements erratic as they scrambled away from the heat. It wasn't noticeable to most people yet, but I saw them. Then dozens, crawling, scurrying, seeking escape. Then came the swarm. The fire had agitated them beyond reason. The heat drove them out in droves, panicked and furious, their survival instincts kicking into full gear. Within seconds, hundreds of fire ants poured out of the burning log like a living wave, tumbling onto the fire pit stones and spilling out onto the ground, their tiny legs moving in a frenzy of confusion and rage. And Karen was standing right next to it. She didn't notice at first, not until the first wave of ants reached her boots. Then she felt it, the first bite. She let out a sharp yelp, swatting at her leg. But before she could even process what had happened, another bite, then another, and another. The ants were everywhere, crawling up her shoes, her ankles, under the hem of her perfectly pressed trousers. And then she screamed, a high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek that cut through the crisp night air like a knife. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Something's biting me!" She staggered backward, her arms flailing wildly, her hands slapping at her legs as more and more ants poured out of the firewood pile, swarming across the ground, biting everything in their path. People nearby gasped and jumped back as the ants spread like wildfire. Chairs tipped over. Cups of cider were flung into the air as the crowd reacted to the unexpected invasion. Karen, in full-blown hysterics, danced in place, shaking her legs wildly, trying to kick off the ants that had latched onto her skin. She stomped, twisted, slapped at her arms, but it was no use, and then she tripped. Her foot caught on the leg of a folding chair, sending her sprawling backward into the refreshments table. The massive bowl of spiced cider toppled over, spilling its sticky contents all over her head and shoulders. The liquid soaked her expensive coat, drenching her hair and face in a steaming mess. And the ants loved it. They crawled faster, sticking to the cider-soaked fabric, biting indiscriminately. Karen shrieked, thrashing wildly, looking like a possessed scarecrow as she tried to fling them off. Her perfect, controlled image completely shattered. The crowd had gone from horrified gasps to barely contained laughter. A few people tried to step forward to help, but Karen's sheer panic made her impossible to approach. And then, in a final, desperate attempt to escape, she ran. But she didn't just run. She sprinted straight through the park, screaming the whole way, heading for the lake at the edge of the event space. She didn't even hesitate. With a loud splash, she launched herself into the freezing water, disappearing beneath the surface before resurfacing, sputtering and gasping for air. The silence that followed was thick. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single chuckle. Then another. Then the entire neighborhood erupted into laughter. People clutched their stomachs, wiping away tears. Even the usually stone-faced HOA vice president, Barbara, was doubled over, shaking with barely contained mirth. The tyrant of the HOA, the queen of the neighborhood, the woman who controlled everything, was now sitting in the freezing lake, drenched in cider and humiliation. Karen, trembling, her makeup running down her face, her once pristine outfit ruined, clambered out of the water, looking like something straight out of a horror movie. Without a word, without a shred of dignity left, she stomped toward her car, soaking wet, and drove away into the night. She never said goodbye. She never looked back. And just like that, the reign of HOA Karen was over. I took a slow sip of my cider, watching her taillights disappear. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt free. And as I tossed another log into my own fire later that night, I smiled, because this time I could finally enjoy it in peace.